The screen lit up before I even heard my father's voice, a bright white projection cutting across the dim dining room wall, and for a second all I could see was my own name in bold black letters under the words DNA paternity result, as if my entire identity had been reduced to a headline at my own 30th birthday party. I remember the way the crystal glasses froze midair, the way conversations collapsed into silence, the way my mother didn't look at me but instead kept her eyes fixed on that screen like it held something she'd been waiting years to confirm, and then my father cleared his throat, slow and deliberate, like he was about to announce a business merger instead of dismantling his daughter's place in the family, and said, "I think it's time everyone here understands the truth about Emily." And just like that, 30 people turned toward me at once, not with curiosity but with that quiet, invasive kind of judgment that makes you feel like you've already been found guilty of something you don't understand yet. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I just stood there in a navy dress I had spent 2 weeks choosing, holding a glass of champagne I suddenly couldn't feel in my hand, because somewhere between the first flicker of that screen and the shift in the room, I realized this wasn't a celebration, it was a setup, and the worst part was I should have seen it coming, because this wasn't the first time my existence had been questioned, just the first time it was being done. With an audience, growing up I was always different in ways no one explained out loud but everyone enforced quietly, the only one not included in certain conversations, the only one who had to earn things my younger sister Olivia received without asking, the only one my father introduced with a pause before my name, like he had to remind himself to say it, and I used to think it was just favoritism, just one of those uneven family dynamics people don't talk about but learn to live with. Until I got older and started noticing the pattern behind it, the way every disagreement somehow circled back to me not belonging, the way my father would look at me during arguments with my mother like I was evidence of something he could never quite prove, and yet there were moments, small ones, where I let myself believe things were normal, like the night my mom sat on the edge of my bed when I was 16 and said, "No matter what happens, you're still mine," and I held on to that sentence like it meant safety, like it meant I didn't have to question anything deeper. Like it meant I could stop wondering why I always felt slightly outside my own family. But standing there at my own birthday, watching my father gesture toward a screen that was about to define me in front of everyone I'd ever known, I realized those moments weren't reassurance, they were preparation. And as the first line of the result came into focus and a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, I felt something unexpected settle inside me, not panic, not even anger, but a strange, quiet certainty, because what they didn't know, what none of them knew as they stared at that screen waiting for my world to collapse, was that 2 weeks earlier in a lab across town, I had already seen a different version of this story, and the truth they were about to reveal wasn't the one that was going to matter. I heard a few soft gasps before I even fully read the line on the screen, the kind of quiet reactions people try to hide but cannot, and then someone near the back whispered something that I could not make out, but I did not need to because I could already feel the shift in the room, the invisible line that had just been drawn between me and everyone else, and my father let the silence stretch just long enough to make sure every single person had time to process what they were seeing before he spoke again, his voice calm, controlled, almost practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment more than once. "According to these results, I am not Emily's biological father." And just like that, the sentence landed clean and sharp, and I could feel 30 pairs of eyes pressing into me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for denial or tears or anything that would confirm the role they had already assigned me in this unfolding scene. My sister Olivia stood near the cake table, her arms folded, watching me with a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes, and I realized she was not surprised, not even a little, which meant she had known about this before tonight, maybe even helped set it up, and somehow that hurt more than anything my father had just said. I looked at my mother then, searching for something, anything, but she still would not meet my gaze, her hands clasped together so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned pale, and in that moment I understood something I had spent years avoiding. She was not going to stop this, she had never stopped any of it. Not the comments, not the distance, not the quiet exclusions that built up over time until they became something much bigger than any one moment. Someone near the front cleared their throat and asked softly if there had been some kind of mistake, but my father shook his head, already prepared for that question. "We had the test done through a certified lab," he said, gesturing toward the document projected behind him. "There is no error." And then he turned to me finally, his eyes settling on mine with a kind of detached finality that made it clear he believed this was the end of something, not the beginning. "If you have anything you want to say, now would be the time." And for a second I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because of how predictable it all felt, the setup, the expectation, the way they were all waiting for me to defend myself against something I had not even been part of deciding. I could feel my heartbeat steady instead of race, which surprised me, because I had imagined this moment so many times over the years in different forms, different accusations, different outcomes, but I had never imagined feeling this calm, this clear, like everything that used to confuse me had suddenly aligned into something simple and undeniable. I set my glass down on the table beside me, the soft clink sounding louder than it should have in the silence, and I noticed a few people leaning forward slightly, as if they did not want to miss whatever I was about to say. And that was when I realized this was not just about humiliation, it was about control, about defining me in a way that would make everything they had ever done feel justified. And for the first time in my life, I was not interested in fitting into that definition. I took a breath, slow and steady, and looked back at the screen, at the result they had chosen to present as the truth, and I thought about the envelope sitting in my bag across the room, the one I had picked up 14 days ago from a quiet office with neutral walls and a technician who did not know my name, only my sample number, and I remembered the way my hands had trembled then, not from fear, but from the weight of finally having something concrete, something that did not depend on anyone else's version of events. I shifted my gaze back to my father, who was still watching me with that same composed expression, waiting for me to break, and I realized he had no idea how wrong he was about what was coming next, because the story he thought he was telling tonight was only half of what had already been written, and the part he could not see, the part no one in that room was prepared for, had been waiting quietly for the exact moment when everyone believed they already knew the truth. I did not answer him right away, and that was the first thing that unsettled them, because they were expecting a reaction, something immediate and emotional that would confirm everything they already believed about me. But instead I just looked around the room slowly, taking in each face, the neighbors who had watched me grow up, the co-workers who had only ever known the version of me my parents chose to present, the extended family who had quietly accepted every narrative without ever questioning it, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This was never about one test result. This was about years of shaping a story where I was always the outsider, always the uncertain variable, always the one who could be explained away if necessary. I let my gaze settle briefly on Olivia again and noticed the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table just slightly, like she was bracing for something she could not quite predict. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because if she were completely confident in what was happening, she would have been relaxed, almost triumphant, but instead there was tension there, a crack in the certainty they had built tonight. My father shifted his weight, clearly growing impatient with my silence, and repeated himself slower this time, "Emily, if you have something to say." And that was when I finally spoke, my voice steady, almost too calm for the situation. "I just want to make sure I understand," I said, glancing back at the screen as if I were considering it seriously. "You are saying this test proves I am not your daughter?" And he nodded once, firm and decisive. "That is exactly what it proves." And a few people in the room murmured softly, as if the repetition made it more real. I tilted my head slightly, as if thinking it through, and then asked the one question he clearly had not prepared for. "And you are absolutely certain the result you are showing everyone is complete?" And for the first time there was a pause, small but noticeable, before he answered, "Yes." And I saw it then, that flicker of irritation at being questioned instead of obeyed. The same look he had given me my entire life whenever I did not immediately accept his version of things. I nodded slowly, as if that settled something for me, and then I reached for my purse, which had been resting on a chair just a few feet away, and I could feel the shift in the room again, curiosity replacing judgment for just a moment as people leaned in slightly, trying to understand what I was doing, because this was not following the script they had expected. I slid my hand inside and felt the edge of the envelope, thick, official, the paper inside heavier than the standard printouts most labs used. And for a brief second I remembered the day I picked it up, the sterile office, the quiet confirmation that the results had been verified twice, the technician explaining the chain of custody like it mattered more than anything else, and I realized now why that detail had stayed with me, because tonight was not just about truth, it was about credibility, about which version people would believe when two completely different realities were placed in front of them. I pulled the envelope out slowly but did not open it yet, just held it in my hand, letting it be seen without explaining it, and I watched as my father's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not fear exactly, but something closer to uncertainty, like he had just realized there was a variable he had not accounted for. Olivia straightened slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was trying to read the situation faster than it was unfolding. And my mother finally looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that night, and there was something in her expression I had not seen in years, not guilt, not exactly, but recognition, like she understood before anyone else that this was not going to end the way they had planned. I let the silence stretch again, not out of hesitation but on purpose this time, because I could feel the attention tightening around me, every second pulling them further into a moment they could no longer control, and then I said quietly, "That is interesting," and glanced down at the envelope in my hand, because 2 weeks ago, I asked a different lab the exact same question, and I could almost hear the room inhale all at once, the sound subtle but unmistakable, as if something had just shifted beneath their feet, and I looked back up at my father, meeting his eyes without flinching, and the answer they gave me does not match what you are showing tonight, and for the first time since this all started, he did not respond immediately, and that silence, that brief, fragile hesitation, told me everything had just changed, even if no one else in the room understood it yet. The moment the words left my mouth, the room did not explode into chaos like you might expect. It did something quieter and far more revealing. It hesitated, as if every person there was suddenly unsure which version of reality they were supposed to believe, and I watched that uncertainty spread from one face to another like a ripple, subtle but undeniable, and my father straightened slightly, recovering faster than most, his expression tightening into something sharper, more controlled. "That is not possible," he said, his tone no longer calm but edged with something close to irritation. "We used a certified lab," and I nodded almost thoughtfully. "So did I replied, my voice still steady, still measured, and that seemed to unsettle him more than if I had raised my voice or shown anger, because calm does not fit the role they had assigned me tonight. Olivia let out a small breath, almost a laugh but not quite, and stepped forward just enough to be seen more clearly. "Emily, this is not the time to create confusion," she said, her voice light but forced, like she was trying to steer the moment back onto the path they had planned. "The results are right there." And she gestured toward the screen, but I noticed she did not look at it when she said that. She looked at me, watching carefully, as if trying to gauge how much I actually knew. I shifted the envelope slightly in my hand, letting the edge catch the light so it was impossible to ignore, and I saw several guests glance between it and the projection behind me, comparing two unseen truths without even realizing they were doing it, and for the first time that night, the attention in the room was not just on me as the subject of the story, it was on me as the person who might control how it ended. My mother took a small step forward then, her voice quieter than the others but carrying in the silence, "Emily, maybe we should talk about this privately." And that was the closest she had come all night to intervening, but even that was not protection, it was containment, an attempt to move the situation away from witnesses before it could fully shift, and I realized that instinct had always been there, not to defend me, but to manage appearances. I shook my head gently, not in defiance but in clarity. "No," I said. "I think this is exactly where we should talk about it." And I let that sentence sit for a moment because I knew what it meant, not just for me, but for everyone who had come expecting a simple narrative with a clear conclusion. My father's jaw tightened slightly, the composure he had been holding beginning to show small cracks. "If you have some kind of document," he said, choosing his words carefully now, "then you should understand that one unofficial test does not override verified results." And there it was, the attempt to discredit before even seeing it, to frame my evidence as weaker before it had a chance to exist in the same space as his. I nodded again as if I agreed with the principle and then said quietly, "That is why I did not bring just one." And for a fraction of a second the room went completely still, not even a whisper, not even the soft clink of glassware. Just silence that felt heavier than anything before it, and I watched as my father's expression shifted again, not fully, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me, because I had spent years learning to read the smallest changes in him, the ones that revealed what he would never say out loud. Olivia's posture changed too, her confidence faltering just slightly as she glanced toward my mother and then back at me, as if recalculating something she thought had already been settled. I looked down at the envelope in my hand and ran my thumb lightly along the edge, feeling the thickness of multiple pages inside, the weight of something that had been verified, documented, and sealed long before tonight, and then I lifted my eyes back to the room, letting my gaze move slowly from one person to another, making sure they were still with me, still listening, still invested in what they thought was already decided, and I said, I went to 2 independent labs, pausing just long enough for the implication to land. Separate facilities, separate technicians, separate chains of custody. And I could see it now, the shift was no longer subtle, it was real, because this was no longer a disagreement, it was a contradiction, and contradictions demand resolution. My father opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out immediately, and that was the first time I had ever seen him without a ready answer, without control of the narrative, and I realized in that moment that the balance in the room had already started to tilt, even if no one had acknowledged it yet, because what they thought was the final reveal was only the beginning of something they had not prepared for at all. No one spoke for a few seconds after I said that, and it was not the kind of silence that feels empty, it was the kind that feels crowded, like every person in the room was suddenly holding a thought they did not know how to say out loud, and I could see it in the way people shifted their weight, the way a couple of guests exchanged quick glances, the way someone near the back lowered their glass slowly without taking a sip, because now there were 2 versions of the same story in front of them, and neither one could be ignored. My father finally stepped forward again, closing a small part of the distance between us, not enough to seem aggressive, just enough to reassert control. Then show it, he said, his voice firmer now, sharper, as if volume could restore authority. If you have something that contradicts this, then let everyone see it. And there it was, the moment he believed would force me into the open, the moment he thought would either expose me or confirm him. And for years I would have hesitated, I would have second-guessed myself, wondered if I was about to make things worse, but standing there now, with 30 people watching and the version of me they had always believed hanging in the balance, I realized something had already shifted inside me long before tonight, something that no longer needed their approval to exist. I nodded once, not in submission but in agreement, and carefully opened the envelope, the sound of paper sliding against paper cutting through the silence in a way that felt louder than it should have. And I pulled out the documents one at a time, not rushing, not dramatizing, just letting the process unfold in a way that made it impossible to dismiss, and I could feel every eye tracking the movement, waiting, recalibrating. I held the first page up just enough for those closest to see the official header, the lab certification, the identification numbers that matched my name, and then I spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that no one had to lean in to hear. Independent laboratory. Accredited, chain of custody verified. And I placed that page down on the table in front of me before lifting the second facility, same standards, separate technicians, and this time I turned slightly, so more of the room could see the matching format, the consistency that was not coincidence but confirmation, and I did not need to explain what that meant, because even those who did not understand the technical details could recognize repetition as reliability. My father's expression had changed now, the certainty he started with replaced by something more guarded, his eyes moving between the documents in my hand and the projection behind him as if trying to reconcile them, and Olivia had gone completely still, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a tight, controlled silence that said she was thinking faster than she was speaking. I lowered the pages slightly and let my gaze return to my father, holding it there long enough to make sure he understood that this was no longer one-sided. Both tests confirmed the same result, I said, and I saw it then, the smallest flicker of anticipation in the room, because now they were not just watching a situation unfold, they were waiting for an answer that could change everything they thought they understood. I paused, not because I needed time but because they did, because the space between information and conclusion is where tension lives, and I let that tension build just enough before continuing, and according to both of them, I added, my voice still steady, still controlled, I am biologically related to you. And this time the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, a ripple of confusion that moved through the room as quickly as certainty had earlier, because now the narrative they had been handed no longer held together in a simple way. My father's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no quick response, no immediate dismissal, just a pause that stretched longer than before, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the attempt to find a version of events where he was still right, where this did not unravel what he had just declared in front of everyone. I let the words settle, did not rush to explain further, because I knew the next part was not something they were expecting at all, not something that fit into the story they had built around me for years, and as I looked at each of them one by one, I realized they were no longer watching me as the problem, they were watching me as the source of an answer they had not considered, and what they did not understand yet, what none of them could see coming, was that proving I belonged, was only the first layer of a truth that was about to shift the focus somewhere else entirely. The reaction did not come all at once, it unfolded in layers, first confusion, then disbelief, and then something heavier that settled over the room like a realization no one wanted to be the first to say out loud, because if I was telling the truth, if the documents in my hands were real, then the question was no longer about me, it was about what had just been shown on that screen and who had chosen to show it. My father let out a slow breath, the kind people take when they are buying time, and stepped closer to the table where I had placed the pages, his eyes scanning them quickly but not carelessly, and I could see the shift happening in real time, the confidence he walked into this moment with no longer matching what he was seeing, and for a second, just a second, he looked uncertain in a way I had never seen before. "That does not make sense," he said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something more controlled, more cautious, like he was aware now that every word mattered in a way it had not a few minutes ago, and I tilted my head slightly, not in challenge, just in acknowledgement. "I agree," I said quietly, "it does not." And that was the truth, not just for him, but for everyone standing there trying to reconcile two completely different outcomes. Olivia took a small step back, almost instinctively, her earlier position near the center of the room shifting toward the edge as if she wanted to observe rather than be seen, and I noticed the way her gaze flickered toward my mother again, searching for something, guidance maybe or confirmation, but my mother did not move, she stood exactly where she had been, her expression no longer distant but focused, watching the documents, watching me, and I realized she was not surprised by what I had just said. Not entirely, and that realization landed somewhere deeper than anything else that had happened tonight. One of the guests, a family friend who had known us for years, spoke up hesitantly. Could there have been a mix-up with the samples? And it was the first attempt anyone had made to find a neutral explanation, something that would allow both versions to exist without conflict, but I shook my head gently. "Both labs verified identity before testing," I said, keeping my tone even, factual, because this was no longer about emotion, it was about structure, about what could and could not be dismissed. Photo identification, documented chain of custody, cross-check samples, and as I spoke I could see people processing not just the information, but the consistency, the way the details aligned in a way that made coincidence unlikely. My father set the papers back down carefully, slower than he had picked them up, and looked at the screen behind him again. And for the first time since this began, the projection did not look like proof, it looked like a question, and I watched as that realization moved through him, subtle but unmistakable, because if both things could not be true, then one of them had to be wrong, and the one he had just presented to everyone was no longer as certain as it had seemed. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, not defensive, not closed, just steady, and said, "So if I am biologically related to you," letting the sentence hang just long enough to draw attention to what came next, "then the result you showed tonight cannot be complete." And there it was, the shift made explicit, the point where the focus moved away from me and toward the gap in their version of events. Olivia's voice came out sharper than before. "What are you implying?" she asked, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter, less controlled, and I turned my head slightly toward her, meeting her gaze fully for the first time that night, and said, "I am not implying anything," my voice calm, almost gentle. "I am just following the facts." And that was when I saw it, the moment her composure slipped, just enough to confirm what I had started to suspect. The second I saw her expression earlier, I looked back at my father, who was still standing between the screen and the table, caught between two sets of evidence, and I realized he was not just questioning the result anymore. He was questioning the process, the source, the assumption he had relied on without verifying, and as the silence returned, heavier than before, I knew we had crossed a line that could not be undone. Because this was no longer about proving whether I belonged, it was about uncovering what had been hidden to make it seem like I did not, and what they still did not understand, what none of them were ready to face yet, was that the answer to that question was not going to point back at me at all. The silence after my last sentence did not feel like confusion anymore, it felt like pressure, like something was building beneath the surface that no one could stop once it started moving, and I could see it in the way my father's eyes shifted again. No longer scanning for flaws in my documents but searching backward, retracing steps he had clearly taken for granted, and that was when I realized something important. He had trusted the result he presented tonight because he believed the source was unquestionable, and if that assumption was wrong, then everything built on top of it started to collapse. He turned slowly toward Olivia, not fully, just enough to include her in his line of sight. And it was subtle, so subtle most people would have missed it, but I did not, because I had spent years noticing the smallest changes in this family dynamic, the way responsibility moved when things went wrong, the way attention shifted when control slipped, and for the first time that shift was not pointing at me. Olivia felt it too. I could see it in the way her shoulders straightened slightly, like she was preparing herself, her expression tightening into something more deliberate, more careful, and she spoke before he could say anything. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her voice sharper now, less polished. "You are trying to twist things because you do not like what the result says." And a few people nodded instinctively, not because they were convinced, but because it was easier to follow the familiar narrative than to question it. And I recognized that pattern immediately. It was the same one that had worked for years, the one that kept everything simple by keeping me in the role they had already decided I fit into. I did not react to her tone, did not match it, because I understood something she did not yet realize. The moment had already moved past emotional arguments. It was about consistency now, about which version of events could hold together under scrutiny, and I said calmly, "I am not twisting anything, letting my words land without force. I am just asking why two verified tests say one thing, and the result you showed says another." And I saw it again, that flicker in her expression, the one that appeared when the conversation shifted away from accusation and toward logic, because logic requires alignment, and alignment was exactly what was missing here. My father's voice came in lower this time, more controlled than before. "Where did this test come from?" he asked, not looking at me now but at the document still resting on the table. And it was a different kind of question, not dismissive, not performative, but investigative, and that change mattered more than anything else that had happened tonight. "Two accredited facilities," I answered, steady and direct. "One in the city, one out of state, separate processing, separate verification." And I could see him processing that, not emotionally but methodically, the way he approached everything he could not immediately control. And that was when I noticed my mother take a small step forward, almost unconsciously, her attention no longer divided but focused entirely on Olivia. And there was something in that look, something that carried weight, history, something unspoken that had been there long before tonight. Olivia noticed it too, and for the first time since this began she hesitated just slightly, and that hesitation did more than any accusation could have, because it broke the image she had been maintaining, the certainty she had relied on to keep everything in place. I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself in the moment, and said quietly, "If my result is consistent across two independent labs," pausing just enough to let the implication form on its own, "then the inconsistency is not coming from me." And I did not need to say anything more than that, because the room had already begun to follow the logic to its natural conclusion, even if no one wanted to say it out loud yet. My father turned back toward the screen one more time, looking at it differently now, not as confirmation, but as something that needed to be questioned, and then his gaze moved again, slower this time, toward Olivia. And that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but real, because for the first time in my life, I was not the one being examined, not the one being measured against an expectation I could never meet. And as that realization settled over the room, I understood something that had been hidden for years. The story they built around me was never meant to reveal the truth. It was meant to hide it. And now that the foundation of that story had cracked, what was underneath it was starting to show, whether they were ready for it or not. The room did not need anyone to say it out loud because the direction of every gaze had already shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough that it could not be ignored anymore. And I watched as my father's attention settled on Olivia with a kind of focus that felt unfamiliar, like he was seeing her through a different lens for the first time, not as the one who had always been certain, always been right, but as a variable he had never thought to question. Olivia noticed it immediately, her posture tightening as she straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting slightly as if she could hold her position through confidence alone, and she spoke quickly, too quickly. "This is not about me," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the silence. "Emily is trying to distract from the fact that the results are right there." And she gestured again toward the screen, but this time fewer people followed the motion. Fewer people looked at the projection as the final answer, because now it was no longer the only version of the truth in the room. I did not interrupt her, did not challenge her directly, because I understood something she did not. The more she pushed, the more visible the cracks became, and I simply said, "You are right, it is not about distraction," letting the words land calmly without accusation. "It is about consistency." And I turned slightly toward the table where the documents rested, not to emphasize them again, but to remind everyone they were still there. Still part of the equation that could not be ignored. My father took another step closer to Olivia now, not confrontational but deliberate, and asked quietly, "Where did the original test come from?" And that question changed everything because it was no longer directed at me, it was directed at her, and the shift was complete. Olivia blinked once, just once, but it was enough. "From the lab," she said, her answer vague, too vague, and I could see it register with him immediately. The lack of detail where there should have been clarity, the absence of specifics in a moment that demanded them. "Which lab?" he asked, his tone still controlled but firmer now, and the room seemed to hold its breath again. Not because they expected conflict, but because they were beginning to understand that the answer mattered in a way it had not a few minutes ago. Olivia hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than anything she could have said, because it broke the rhythm of certainty she had maintained all night, and she glanced briefly toward my mother before answering. "The one we discussed," she said, and even as the words left her mouth I could see the problem with them. They were not an answer. They were a deflection, and deflection only works when no one is looking closely. My mother's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, her lips pressing together slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she looked at Olivia. And in that moment I understood something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. She knew more than she had ever said, more than she had ever allowed herself to show. I stepped forward just enough to close the distance between myself and the table, not to take control of the space but to remain part of it, and said quietly, "Both of my tests included full documentation, letting my voice remain even, factual, lab names, technician signatures, verification codes." And I let the list settle into the room, not as a challenge but as a contrast, something that highlighted what was missing without needing to point it out directly. My father's gaze did not leave Olivia now, and I could see the shift fully. The transition from assumption to investigation, from certainty to doubt, and that change was irreversible because once doubt enters, it does not leave easily. Olivia exhaled slowly, trying to regain control. "This is unnecessary," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something tighter, more controlled, as if she was choosing each word carefully instead of speaking naturally. "The result is already clear." And for the first time, someone near the back spoke up, not loudly but enough to be heard. "It is not clear anymore." And that was it, the moment the room stopped following her lead, the moment the narrative shifted beyond her control. I did not smile, did not react outwardly, but inside I felt the shift settle into place, solid and undeniable, because the question was no longer whether I belonged, it was whether the story that had been built around me had ever been true at all. And as my father stood there, looking at Olivia not with anger but with a growing need for answers, I realized we were no longer moving toward a confrontation, we were moving toward a revelation, one that had been waiting for years beneath layers of assumption and silence. And what they still did not see, what Olivia was trying to hold back with every word she spoke, was that the truth was no longer something she could control once it started to surface. The shift in the room was no longer subtle now, it had weight, direction, and momentum, and I could feel it settling into place as every unanswered question began pointing in the same direction, not toward me but toward Olivia. And for the first time since the night began, she did not step forward, she did not take control of the moment, she stayed exactly where she was, as if moving might make everything more visible. My father's voice came again, quieter than before but carrying more authority than it had earlier. "Olivia," he said, and the way he said her name was different, not accusatory, not yet, but deliberate, like he was choosing to focus where he had not looked before. "I asked you a question." And there was no way to misunderstand what he meant now, no room left for deflection without it being obvious. Olivia swallowed, a small movement but impossible to miss in the stillness, and said, "I already told you." But the words did not land the way they had earlier, they sounded thinner, less certain, like they were missing something that had been there before. I watched her carefully, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with a kind of clarity I had never felt before, because for years I had been on the receiving end of this kind of scrutiny, this quiet dissection of words and pauses and inconsistencies, and now I was seeing it from the other side. My mother finally stepped forward then, closing the distance between herself and Olivia in a way that felt intentional, and she spoke softly but every word carried. "Which lab?" she asked, repeating the question my father had already asked, but this time it sounded different, not like a demand but like something deeper, something that needed to be answered honestly. Olivia looked at her, really looked at her. And for a second I saw something break through. The composure she had been holding onto all night, something uncertain, something almost like hesitation, and that hesitation stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. It was handled, Olivia said finally, her voice controlled but no longer confident. Everything was arranged. And the moment the words left her mouth, I knew she had made a mistake, because vague answers do not hold up when specifics are required. And everyone in that room could feel it even if they could not articulate it. My father's expression hardened slightly, not in anger but in focus. Arranged by who? He asked, and there it was, the question that could not be answered without revealing something. Because it moved beyond the result and into the process, beyond the conclusion and into how it was created. Olivia's eyes flickered again, just briefly, toward my mother, and that was when I saw it, the connection, the shared understanding that had been hidden behind years of silence. And my mother's face changed in a way I had never seen before, not defensive, not distant but aware, fully aware of what was happening and what it meant. I did not interrupt, did not step in because this was no longer my moment to push, it was their moment to confront what had been avoided for years. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the silence force the truth forward. A guest near the side of the room shifted and whispered something to the person next to them, and even though I could not hear the words, I knew what they were about, because the room had already started to reach the same conclusion independently, piece by piece, and once people start connecting those pieces themselves, no explanation can undo it. Olivia straightened slightly as if trying to regain control, but her voice came out tighter than before. This is being blown out of proportion, she said, but the statement no longer matched the reality of the room, because nothing about this felt small anymore, not after everything that had been revealed. I looked at my father then, and for the first time he was not looking at me at all. His attention fixed entirely on Olivia, on the gap between what she was saying and what could be proven, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully believe before. The narrative that had defined me for years was not just flawed, it was constructed, carefully, intentionally, and now that construction was starting to come apart in front of everyone. I took a slow breath, grounding myself as the tension built again, heavier than before, and said quietly, not to challenge, but to complete the picture. Both of my tests included full parental matching, letting the words settle into the silence. Not just paternity but full family alignment. And I watched as that detail landed, because it did not just confirm where I belonged, it implied something else entirely, something that had not yet been said out loud but was already forming in every mind in the room. And as the silence stretched once more, I knew we were only one step away from the part of the truth they had never considered at all. The moment I said full family alignment, it was like something invisible in the room finally snapped into focus, not completely, not all at once, but enough that people started looking at each other differently, as if they were all arriving at the same thought from different directions and no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. My father did not speak immediately, but I could see it in the way his posture changed, the way his shoulders squared slightly as if he was bracing himself for something he could not yet define, and then he asked, slower this time, more deliberate than before, "What exactly do you mean by that?" And the question was not for show anymore, it was real, grounded in the realization that the situation had moved beyond simple contradiction. I did not rush to answer, because this was the moment everything hinged on, not just what I said but how it landed, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the question to settle over the room, for everyone to lean in without realizing they were doing it, and then I said, "It means the test did not just compare me to you." My voice steady, measured. It compared the entire family structure. And I watched as the meaning began to unfold across their faces, not instantly but step by step, like a pattern revealing itself the longer you looked at it. Olivia's expression changed first, not dramatically, but enough that I saw it, the flicker of something that had not been there before, not just tension but awareness, like she understood exactly where this was going before anyone else did. And she shifted her weight slightly, as if preparing to respond before the conclusion could fully form. My mother inhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, but I heard it, and when I looked at her, I saw something in her eyes that stopped me for a second, not fear, not denial but recognition, deep and quiet, like a memory resurfacing that she had spent years keeping buried. "So what are you saying?" Olivia asked quickly, her voice tighter now, no longer trying to sound composed but struggling to stay ahead of the moment, and I turned my head toward her, meeting her gaze fully, not with accusation but with clarity. "I am saying the results do not just confirm where I belong. I said, pausing just long enough for the implication to take shape. They also show where something does not align. And the room reacted before anyone spoke. Subtle shift, a collective intake of breath, because now the conclusion was no longer abstract, it was directional. My father's eyes moved between us, from me to Olivia and back again, and I could see the calculation happening, the process of eliminating possibilities, narrowing outcomes, and I realized this was the first time he was not relying on assumption or expectation. He was following evidence, and that difference changed everything. "That is not possible," Olivia said, but the words came out too quickly, too forcefully, and that alone weakened them, because certainty does not need to rush, it does not need to defend itself before being questioned, and I saw it register with everyone else too, the mismatch between her tone and the situation. I did not raise my voice, did not push, I simply reached for the final page in my hand, the one I had not yet placed on the table, and held it up just enough for the official seal to catch the light, for the format to match the others, in a way that made it part of the same verified system, and I said quietly, both labs included sibling comparison markers, and this time the reaction was immediate, not loud but undeniable, because now the implication had a structure, a mechanism, something that could not be dismissed as interpretation. My father stepped closer, his attention fully locked on the document now, and I could see it. The moment he connected the last piece, the moment the question shifted from what is wrong with Emily to what has been wrong this entire time, and he did not look at me when he spoke next, he looked at Olivia. "What does that mean?" he asked, and his voice was no longer uncertain, it was controlled, focused, the way it sounded when he was no longer making assumptions but demanding clarity. Olivia did not answer right away, and that silence, that hesitation, carried more weight than anything else that had happened tonight, because it confirmed what words could not yet say. And as the room held its breath again, waiting, I understood that we had reached the edge of the truth, the point where it could no longer be contained by half-explanations or careful phrasing, and what they still did not realize, what Olivia was trying to hold back with every second of silence, was that the next answer would not just change how they saw me, it would change how they saw everything they thought they knew about this family. No one moved when my father asked that question, not because they did not hear it, but because they understood exactly what it meant, and the weight of it settled over the room in a way that made even the smallest movement feel out of place, and I watched Olivia closely, because this was the moment everything balanced on, the moment where silence was no longer protection but exposure. She opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, then closed it again, her gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before lifting back up, and that hesitation, that break in her composure, carried more truth than anything she could have said, because for the first time, she did not have a version of the story ready. My father did not look away, did not fill the silence for her, and that alone told me how far things had shifted, because he had always been the one to lead, to define, to conclude, but now he was waiting, not for me, but for her. "Olivia," he said again, slower this time, each word deliberate. "What does that mean?" And there was no anger in his voice, not yet, just a controlled insistence that left no room for deflection. Olivia inhaled, her shoulders rising slightly before settling, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, stripped of the confidence she had carried into the night. "It means nothing," she said, but the words did not land, they did not hold, because everyone in the room could feel the gap between what she was saying and what had already been revealed. My mother took another step forward then, closer than she had been all night, and said softly, "Olivia." And there was something in the way she said her name, something layered with years of things unsaid, and Olivia looked at her again, really looked this time, and whatever she saw there made her expression change, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, enough that I understood this was not just about tonight. This was about something that had been carried quietly for a long time. I did not interrupt, did not push, because I could feel the moment unfolding on its own, and sometimes the truth does not need to be forced, it just needs space. My father's gaze shifted briefly toward my mother, then back to Olivia, and I could see the connection forming, the realization that this was not a simple error, not a mix-up, but something more complicated, something that involved more than just one person. Olivia's fingers tightened at her sides, just slightly, and she shook her head almost reflexively. "You are overthinking this," she said, but the words sounded thin now, like they were being held together by effort rather than certainty. And no one moved to support them this time. No one nodded, no one stepped in, because the room had already moved past that stage. I reached down and placed the final page on the table beside the others, aligning it carefully, not as a gesture of control, but as a completion of what I had brought into this moment, and I said quietly, "The markers show full biological alignment between me and both of you," letting the words settle, letting them connect naturally to what had already been said. But they also show that the expected sibling markers do not match. And there it was, no longer implied, no longer hidden behind phrasing, but stated clearly enough that it could not be misunderstood. The reaction was not loud, but it was immediate, a shift in posture, in breathing, in attention as the room absorbed what that meant, not just for me, but for everything they had believed about this family. My father did not speak right away, and when he did, his voice was lower, steadier than before. "Olivia," he said. Again, but this time it was not a question, it was a recognition, an acknowledgement that the focus had changed completely, and that there was no returning to what it had been before. Olivia's eyes moved from him to my mother and then back again, and for the first time since this began, she looked unsure not just of what to say, but of what to do, and that uncertainty filled the space where her confidence had been, making the truth around her impossible to ignore. I stood there, not as the center of the story anymore, but as the one who had stepped out of it, watching as the structure that had defined me for years shifted and reformed into something else entirely. And I realized that this was not just about proving who I was, it was about revealing who I had never been. And as the silence deepened once more, heavier and more final than before, I knew that whatever came next would not just answer a question, it would redefine everything that had been built on the assumption they had just lost. No one rushed to fill the silence after that, because now the truth was no longer hidden behind interpretation. It was sitting in the open, incomplete but undeniable, and I could see it in the way people were no longer looking at me at all, their attention fixed entirely on Olivia, waiting, not for a reaction, but for an explanation that could hold everything together again. My father took a slow breath, the kind that signals a shift from assumption to confrontation, and said her name once more. Not louder, but with a weight that had not been there before, "Olivia." And this time it was not a question, it was a demand for clarity, for something real to replace what had just unraveled. Olivia's eyes moved again, from him to my mother and back, and for a moment she looked like she was searching for an answer outside of herself, something she could borrow, something she could hold on to, but there was nothing there, no interruption, no correction, no one stepping in to redirect the moment. And that absence said more than anything else could have. "It does not mean what you think," she said finally, her voice quieter, controlled but no longer steady, and I recognized it. Immediately, the tone of someone trying to manage a situation that had already slipped beyond their control. My mother closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, and when she opened them again there was no avoidance left, only a kind of tired clarity that made everything feel heavier. "Then explain it," she said softly, and the simplicity of that request cut through everything else, because there was no room left for deflection. No way to answer without stepping directly into the truth. Olivia exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling as if she was trying to steady herself, and for the first time since the night began, she did not speak immediately, she hesitated, and that hesitation stretched long enough for everyone in the room to feel it settle into something final. "It was just supposed to confirm things," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, I knew they were not enough. They were the beginning of something, not the answer itself. My father's expression did not change dramatically, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something sharper, more focused. "Confirm what?" he asked, and his voice carried no room for ambiguity, no space for interpretation. Olivia looked down briefly, then back up, and when she spoke again, the words came slower, more deliberate, like she was choosing each one carefully instead of letting them come naturally. "That everything was the way it was supposed to be," she said, and I saw it. Then the way the room reacted, not with understanding, but with recognition that the answer was still incomplete. I did not interrupt, did not push, because I could feel the moment building towards something that could not be forced, and sometimes the truth arrives not as a statement, but as a realization that spreads from one person to another. My mother stepped closer again, her voice still quiet but carrying more weight than before. "Olivia," she said, "that is not an answer, and this time, there was something else in it, something deeper. Something that made it clear she was not just asking as a parent, but as someone who already understood more than she had ever allowed herself to say." Olivia's composure cracked then, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention instantly, but enough that I saw it, the tension in her jaw, the way her hands shifted slightly at her sides, and when she spoke again there was something different in her voice, not confidence, not control, but something closer to inevitability. "I just wanted it to stay the same," she said, and that sentence, simple as it was, carried everything, because it was not about the test, it was about the narrative, the structure, the version of reality that had been built and maintained for years. My father did not respond immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was lower than before, steadier, but with a clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand. "Stay the same how?" he asked, and this time there was no way around it, no space left to redirect or soften the truth. Olivia's eyes flickered once more toward my mother, and for a second, just a second, I saw the full weight of what had been hidden. There, something shared, something known, something that had never been spoken in front of anyone else. And then she looked back at him, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was final, the kind that comes right before something is finally said that cannot be taken back. And as I stood there, watching the last pieces of the story fall into place, I realized that whatever came next was not just going to answer the question they had asked tonight, it was going to reveal the one they had never thought to ask at all. The silence held for one final second, stretched to its limit, and then Olivia spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that every person in the room heard it without needing to lean in. "Because if things changed," she said, her voice steady in a way that felt different now, not controlled but resigned, "then everything would fall apart." And the words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything that had been said before. Because they were not a denial, not a deflection, but an admission without details. And that made them more powerful than any explanation she could have given. My father did not interrupt her this time, did not try to guide the conversation back into something manageable. He just stood there, watching her, waiting, and I realized this was the first time he was allowing something to unfold without controlling it. Olivia exhaled slowly and continued, "You were always supposed to be the one who did not fit," and her eyes flickered toward me for a brief second before returning to him. It made everything easier. And there it was, the truth not as a single event, but as a structure, a decision that had shaped years of behavior, years of treatment, years of quiet assumptions that no one had questioned because they had all been built on the same foundation. My mother closed her eyes again, longer this time, and when she opened them, there was no distance left, only acceptance of something she had clearly known but never spoken, and she said softly, "Olivia." But there was no correction in her voice, no denial, just a recognition that the moment had finally arrived. My father's expression shifted then, not in anger, not in shock, but in something deeper, something quieter, like the realization was settling into him piece by piece, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than I had ever heard it. "What did you do?" And it was not an accusation, it was a question that carried years of unexamined assumptions behind it. Olivia's shoulders dropped slightly, the last of her composure giving way to something more honest, and she answered without looking away this time. "I made sure the test said what it needed to say." And a soft ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, because now the gap had been filled, the contradiction explained in a way that could not be undone. No one spoke immediately after that, not because they did not have questions, but because they understood that the answer had already changed everything, that the narrative they had accepted without question for years had not just been wrong, it had been shaped, directed, maintained. I stood there, still feeling the shift settle into something final. Not because I had proven something new about myself, but because I had finally stepped out of something that had never truly belonged to me. My father looked at the documents on the table again, then at the screen behind him, and for the first time, neither of them seemed like authority, they were just pieces of information, one real, one altered, and the difference between them was no longer abstract, it was personal. My mother stepped closer to him, not speaking, just standing beside him in a way that felt different from before, not distant, not passive, but present, and I realized that whatever came after tonight would not be simple for any of them because the truth does not just correct the past, it forces you to re-examine it. Olivia did not move, did not try to explain further because there was nothing left to explain that would make it better, and for the first time she was the one standing in the center of something she could not control. I looked around the room one last time at the people who had watched this unfold, who had believed one version and then another, and I understood something with a clarity I had never felt before. I had spent years trying to prove my place in a story that was never written for me honestly, and tonight, without raising my voice, without fighting the way I thought I would have to, I had stepped out of it completely. My gaze returned to the table, to the documents that had started this shift, and then to the screen that had tried to define me, and I felt something settle inside me, not relief exactly, but something close to it, something steady and quiet, and I realized that what they thought would be the moment I lost everything had become the moment I finally understood what had never been mine to lose in the first place. And as the room remained still, caught between what had been and what would come next, I knew that nothing in this family would ever return to what it had been before, not because of what I had revealed, but because of what they could no longer pretend not to see.